Welcome to Innovations in Education. I'm your host, David Adams, CEO of the Urban Assembly. And on this show, we bring guests every single episode who have made things work in public education. This show is about the innovators. This show is about the folks who are solving problems. This show is about making things work in education. Now, there's a lot of shows out there talking about what's wrong in the education systems, and those are great shows. There's some shows talking about what we're not doing well, and there's a lot to learn from those, but that's not this show. This show is going to be featuring educators who are making things work for young people and improving public education. I'm here with some stellar educators from the great state of Ohio. I'm here with Superintendent Shannon Cox, who is the 12th Montgomery County Educational Service Center Superintendent in the organization's history and its first female superintendent. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm also here with Candice Sears, the Director of Instructional Services for Montgomery County Educational Services as well. Candice, welcome to the show.
Hi, David. Thanks for having both of us today.
You're welcome. And I got to say, I've never actually done Innovations in Public Education with not just one, but two innovators in public education. So we're very excited to have you all here today.
We're excited to be here.
Well, I want to start out a conversation. Maybe I can turn this over to you, Shannon. Tell me a little bit about yourself, Ohio, where you grew up. How did we get Innovations in Public Education out from Ohio here today? So maybe Shannon, starting with you, and then Candice, what's your educational journey in Ohio?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually didn't wake up in third grade and want to be a teacher. I actually wanted to be a first female fighter pilot for the United States Air Force.
Wow.
Yeah.
Great opening.
Great opening. A little bit of a different journey, but that clearly didn't work out. And so once I made the decision to go into public education, it actually was a pretty typical trajectory for me. I was a classroom teacher. I was an athletic coach. I became a building principal. I still think that's the best job on the face of the planet. Curriculum director, and then into the assistant superintendent seat, and then the superintendent seat. So once I got here, it was a pretty typical trajectory on how we get here, except for the fact that I became the first female superintendent. So I didn't make the fighter pilot gig, but I made the superintendent gig. So it worked out.
Well, let's just stay with us a little bit before we get to Candice. So you wanted to be the first female fighter pilot for United States Air Force. And then you just kind of said, but that I decided to go to education, but I feel like we're missing a step there. Maybe it's an ejection seat. Let me think about what that connection is.
Yeah, it was a different type of ejection seat. I had a little bit of a medical issue in my senior year in high school. Gotcha. And so I was medically denied to be a pilot. So at that point, I decided that maybe I needed to do some soul searching and find a different career path. And so for a young person that really had that future self vision, we like to call it, for so many years to be a pilot, when that was at that moment taken away from me, it just made me kind of dig deep and do some introspection. And so my dad was a building principal. He had been an athletic director. And I thought, if it was good enough for him, it was the family gig, maybe I should step into that space.
All right. So you had a family history, in this case, not necessarily military service, but of service to our community through education and public education. Thank you for that story, Shannon. I'm going to turn the same question to you. Candice, how did you find yourself in the seat that you sit today?
Yeah, thank you, David, for asking that question. Unlike Shannon, I did wake up and always knew that I wanted to be in education. Grew up in a house that was very servant-based and servant-minded. So I learned a lot from just the experiences growing up at home, but I really wanted to be able to give back. I really wanted to do something good for community, do something good for human beings, but most importantly for students. And having had the opportunity with some pretty stellar educators myself, that kind of was my role model, and decided right after high school I was going to be a teacher, and went through a traditional trajectory in regards to, similar to Shannon, teacher. I was not an athletic coach. That's definitely not something that's been in my, or should I have been. I'll be your cheerleader all day long, but should not be on the field or on a court. But I spent some years in traditional educational classrooms, and then spent some time in higher ed. So spent about 7 years in higher ed while I was still in school district K-12, working in like curriculum roles and gifted education type roles. And then had the wonderful opportunity to be here at the Educational Service Center to work more regionally and at a state level.
Okay, that's such a great story. And I know we've talked about this Educational Service Center before, but most of my listeners probably don't know what an Educational Service Center is. Can you help us understand what you guys do? What does it mean to be a superintendent or a director at an Educational Service Center?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are 39 states that have a similar version of an Educational Service Center. In New York City, in New York in general, they're called BOCES. In Pennsylvania, they're intermediary units or IUs. In Michigan, they're educational service districts. In Georgia, they're regional educational service agencies. So again, 39 states have some sort of variation of us.
Just one U. I just got to be clear. I mean, there are many variations. There's only one U.
All right, I'll take that. In Ohio, there are actually 51 of us across the state. So Michigan, Texas, and Ohio have the most educational service center offices within their states. Some have 6, 9, 11. That's more of the typical number. So it gets pretty interesting. But what we do is we make certain that school districts, both public school, non-charter, non-public schools, or chartered non-public schools, as well as community schools, all have the resources that they need to be able to provide the right opportunities and the right resources to students. So I would say if you had to look like across the nation and say what's like the one through point that most of us provide, it usually revolves around special education or related services. But in some cases, it's very business oriented. They have various relationships with their state boards of education or state departments of education. So again, the makeup kind of looks different in some different states, but our main job is to make certain that we have the resources to provide to our districts so that the students can be successful. And that's sort of our tagline. We serve so students can be successful.
That's very, very, very cool. And as we're thinking about this, I'd love to get to hear from you, Shannon and Candice, your favorite part of your job. So you give it a sense of what you're doing at the ESC. I heard you say your building principal was the favorite portion of your career. What's the favorite part of your job, Shannon and Candice?
Yeah. So, I do think the building principalship is the best job, but I have so much fun in this job every single day. I'm not sure why I don't think this job is the most important, but we get to help districts change the face of education. And I'm going to say it differently, like do school differently. And we get to make certain that if there's a state mandate that comes out, that we are there to help districts put it in play and make certain that it works for them and it works for their community and their families and their students. So the job is never the same. Every day is something different. And then on the flip side of that, we have the liberty and the freedom to be pretty creative in what services we stand up and that we get to provide. I often say that, we can be very reactionary and help districts make certain that they're in compliance and meeting the goals of their strategic plans, but we also get to provide services that sometimes districts don't even know they need yet. And that's very exciting.
All right. So you're thinking about the ability not only to stand up opportunities for your school districts, but to really help them translate those wonderful mandates that we get from our legislators up on high. Candice, what's your favorite?
Yeah, so I feel super blessed and very honored to get to work here at the Educational Service Center that I get to work in. Our leadership is, I would put them against all other leaderships. It's just amazing. But probably the very favorite part of my job is the visionary component. Shannon mentioned, we get to support schools, but for me, I get to listen to schools. I get to kind of sit and listen and hear the things that maybe others aren't hearing because it's that automatic reactionary trying to solve a problem. But I get to really listen, and then I get to come back and think about what is truly best for kids. And then I get to put that visionary component of just really transforming what that might look like. So the creativity component and the visionary component that's what keeps me going every day, for sure.
All right, we're going to stick with you, okay? So I heard creativity and vision. And in fact, when I met you guys, one of the first things that I noticed is that you have immense creativity and immense vision for what public education can do for our young people and our country. So tell me what's at stake. It's 2024. Right now, we're recording this. It's May. People have very different visions for public education. What is at stake when we think about getting public education right for our young people, but also for our country?
So I think for me, when I think about education, David, it really is that key driver of economic and social mobility. And so quality public education, it really does equip students from all different backgrounds, all different experiences with those skills needed to succeed in a very competitive job market. And so for me, it's thinking about breaking those cycles of poverty and contributing to a more equitable society. And that can be through, again, the economic and social mobility, but also the technological changes, the advancements and how quick that's happening, thinking about that constant movement and change in technology. So for me, the traditional educational models, they may not be sufficient to prepare kids for what exists today and what's going to exist in the future. And then the other component there, I think, is just the idea of global competitiveness. So really thinking from a global perspective. I think oftentimes we think about just here in our own country, but that global component is going to be so critical. So that's what's at stake when I'm thinking about the breakdown.
Shannon, what would you add?
I would agree with everything that she said. And then I would say, for me, when I really close my eyes and think about what's at stake, because I'm often told, I want to go on record, I'm often told public education is about 14 votes away from not existing in the state of Ohio. And a couple of weeks ago, I firmly stood up in a meeting and said, call the roll. It's time to get serious. We're either going to put resources and commitment and put the political polarization aside and do what we need to do for public education, or we need to call the roll and then we need to figure out what the next version of education looks like. So when I close my eyes and I think about that, like what's at stake, I see things like hope being at stake. I see futures being at stake. Practically, I have employers that need a workforce that know how to work together, whether it's locally or, as Candice eloquently said, at a global scale.
Right.
And we can't do that if humanity is at stake. And that's where I feel like we are. It's more than just educating students. This is education after Google. We can ask Siri a question. We can ask Alexa a question. My 6-year-old bonus child can get any information that he needs at the whisper, to an electronic device. So it's not about just acquiring information anymore. It's about really making certain that we have humans that have the skills and competencies to be good to one another and to work alongside of one another. So it's more than just workforce. It's also about making certain that our kids feel like they belong and they have a sense of purpose in life. We've got a lot of educational choice in Ohio, and I believe in educational choice, actually. So yeah. I think it's a good thing that parents have options. But at the end of the day, the majority of our students across the nation are educated in the public system. And so we need to make sure we've got that right. During COVID, and I hate to talk about the C word, but during COVID, I used to say, like, we've hovered our proverbial mouse over the 21st century for almost 20-ish years in the 21st century, and we haven't really clicked in. But COVID kind of made us click in. It made us embrace the technology that Candice was talking about. It made us embrace how to teach differently, where learning became the constant and time and environment became the variables. That's important. And that's 21st century learning. So we've got to do better, again, to do education differently, to see it differently, because the purpose of education is different.
Let's go. Let's go. So what is the purpose of education? People will say we can't politicize education, and I disagree. I think education is inherently a political act, right? What we value, what we teach, what we don't teach, all these things has implications for how students see themselves in the world, right? And so let's get at it, right? What do we do in public education, and why is that important?
So we have a big goal here in Montgomery County. It's that 60% of our working age population has not just industry recognized credential, but an industry valued credential, a 2-year or 4-year degree, or some sort of skilled trade, or enlist in the military so that they can have a living wage income. We believe that it's, high school diploma is not the destination anymore. It's a benchmark on the journey of life. And we need to make certain that people can take care of one another. If you don't graduate from high school here in Montgomery County, Ohio, that's $300,000 of services and human service dollars that we have to wrap around those families and those individuals with over the course of a lifetime. And economically, that's challenging. Yeah. Ohio is the third least transient state in the entire nation. 79% of the people who were born in Ohio stay in Ohio.
Did not know that.
I always say, like, our workforce is already here. They're walking our hallways. So when we really think about why it's important to change the purpose of education, or not even to change the purpose changed innately, but to change education to meet the new purpose. The new purpose is to make sure that we have humans that are thriving in our communities. And that means that they have to have some sort of credential or skill set, as well as human competencies to be able to interact with one another. It's a yes and it's not easy to get people to come off of, well, what about the reading and the writing and the arithmetic? Well, yes, we still have to do all of those things as well, but we have to make certain that we can actually answer the question that kids have been asking for generations, like, when will I ever use this? And why do I need to know it? It's no longer just passing the test, even though many of our accountability systems are still based on the test, both at the higher ed level and the P12 level, but it's a different purpose when we get past that high school diploma.
So there's two things, and Candice, I'm going to bring you in for a second, but there's two things that really, really resonate with me, right? Because you talk about the ability of young people to contribute to their communities, and then you use labor, in this case, paid labor, as an example of a way to contribute to your community, right? Military service, another way to contribute to your community. And the role of education I hear from you, Shannon, in this space is preparing the competencies that young people need, right? And whether that's being able to read effectively so that you can understand yourself in the world, but also things like work together and be part of a community and be able to be in relationships. So Candice, how does this resonate with you? How does this vision of education resonate with you? How does this resonate with the politics of the day?
Yeah. So I 100% agree with all the things that Shannon just mentioned. When I was listening to Shannon, I was really kind of thinking through this idea of like, the differing beliefs of the purpose of education. So this idea of foundational skills versus like a holistic development component, workforce prep versus personal enrichment, standardization versus individualization. And so when we really like think about those, all of those components have a place in education, but it really is that in and out and knowing, what should we be focusing on and how, and what does this look like? And how is it all just really, how does it weave together to really create this citizen that is going to go out and be able to be successful, and setting them up with the skills, the content knowledge, the resilience to be able to endure challenges. And then when I think about the pillars, it's that critical thinking, it's that problem solving, it's the being able to work through a situation or work with others through a situation. So those are the pieces that kind of popped out for me as Shannon was talking.
This is interesting to me because I had a conversation with a colleague the other day, and he said, David, when I graduated, he's older than I am. When I graduated high school, the graduation rate was less than 50%, and this was like standard. And then he said when my mother graduated high school, it was around 10, 15%, right? Like most people went to eighth grade. That was just the way that we thought about the role of education. And we talked about how we've shifted from some kids to all kids and the impact of that shift in terms of the teaching profession and the education profession writ large. And I think it's been a little bit underestimated, right? This idea that we've been pushing for 90% graduation rates was an important idea, and I think it's a really important thing to pursue. But just a generation ago, right, 50%, 60% was the standard. And people were still able to contribute to their communities because the pathways to economic mobility were different. So I want to lift up this idea and see how you guys are resonating with those shifts and expectations for the role of education in preparing citizens and people to contribute to their communities.
Yeah, I'll give you a very specific example just here in our region. When the recession hit in 2008, the Dayton region had about 4 Fortune 500 headquartered companies here in the Dayton region, and all 4 of those left. And so when that happened, the jobs that were available from those particular companies required that high school diploma or the equivalency of. And several positions in those companies didn't even require a high school diploma. So the opportunity for people to get to that 8th grade and then either go into an agricultural profession, which was very, not specific to Ohio, but clearly it was it's still our leading industry actually in Ohio is agriculture.
Did not know that.
That was a pathway, if you will. If we talk about the old school pathways, the pathway, get to 8th grade, join the family farm, or work in the farm in the summer, work in the factory in the other months of the year. Or you did get to the high school diploma, and if you were female, you might go into a teaching or nursing degreed program. Otherwise, you became a homemaker. Maybe you were a substitute teacher. Our farmers were our bus drivers because they could use the insurance. The other majority of the population graduated high school and went to work in one of the factories and or secretarial positions or those kinds of things. So it wasn't until 2008 when the recession hit pretty hard here that makeup of what jobs were available was just completely obliterated.
Wow.
And then we entered right into the opioid epidemic. And so then we really had to rethink family structures and supports around families. And it really put a strain on our human service opportunities within the community. But then we had to rebuild ourselves. And I'm not saying that every community went through this, but for us specifically here in the Dayton region, we had to rebuild ourselves. We had to kind of pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and say, okay, do we actually, as a community, do we have resilience? Do we have enough to build rebuild into, and what are we going to rebuild into? And so ironically, microbreweries actually became a hit and provided a lot of jobs to people.
Yeah.
But it became the economic driver within the area that then allowed other manufacturing groups to kind of expand their services. We have Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, as well as the Dayton International Airport sort of in our backyard. So the aerospace industry, defense industry really flourished and took off around that time as well. So again, Candice talked about the innovative technologies that are rapidly coming to us now that we've officially entered, into the 21st century. But we're only going to see more and more sort of reinvention of what our jobs and our workforce look like, especially with the onset of AI, right? We know that that's just going to be a game changer, already has been. It's going to continue to be a game changer, specifically generative AI. So knowing that the workforce and the opportunities are changing, and we're having to keep up, but it was very specific because of some very episodic events that happened in our community. And again, I'm sure every community story is a little different, but we have to take into account that when we have those national moments, and then of course, COVID hitting, that kind of recalibrated everybody yet again. And what does even work look like? And where do we work? And how do we work? And all of those questions. So I think when you see those pivotal moments in our history, we always have that reinvention or recalibration of what communities look like and sound like as we move out of those areas.
I got to say, Shannon, as you narrated that, you have to be one of the most unique educators that I've met who have such a close tie to the relationship of the educational sector and things like industry and workforce development and the overall contribution to the community. Typically speaking, educators tend to be focused on tests, right? And the next version of itself. And I think we've been somewhat siloed as we've been trying to, workforce development has been trying to say to education, hey, look, here are the competencies and here are the skills. And our education sector tends to be really more focused on like, hey, but that's not on the test. So, I don't really care. So I want to really give that shout out because your connection and your intersections between the role of education and what we're trying to do in your community in Dayton, Ohio are much more nuanced than I've heard other people speak of.
Well, I appreciate that. We've worked really hard to make sure that we know what's going on. I mentioned that we were the third least transient state, but we actually are one of the highest rated state for losing intellectual capital. So also, we have a lot of people who stay here, but when we have intellectual capital, it tends to go to the East Coast or West Coast.
Got it.
And so that really has made the difference. And knowing that and knowing the nuances of how those things work, it has to help drive what we do in education. It just has to.
Well, Candice, what is this vision of the relationship between workforce and education mean for instruction? I know you are the head of instruction. You think a lot about this. How do you relate these trends to what does it mean to have high quality instruction across Dayton?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that you're right. I think that, when we think about education, we think about this idea even of just like a portrait of a graduate in a sense, and we're thinking about that model in today's society, it shouldn't just reflect academic proficiency. And so we really have to think about this blend of academic proficiency, critical thinking skills, even personal attributes that prepare our students for a world that is complex, and we're not sure what that's really going to look like, and it's changing so rapidly right now. So when we think about education and when we think about instruction, it isn't just the academics. And we also strongly believe that oftentimes, if we don't have those personal attributes considered, like the wellness component of a student too, if that's not considered, it's really hard for students to have the minds to be able to receive the academic components. And so we really think about the whole child, and it's not just the academic piece, but it's also just that mental wellness piece and the behavioral piece. So we don't do anything in silos. We always have all of that considered, and the personalized approach. And so somebody not too long ago, Shannon and I were somewhere, and somebody said, now the buzzword is personalized learning, and the idea of not personalized, but personal, like making that learning personal. So that has really stuck to like this idea of what does instruction look like for kids, and what do those experiences look like that are more personal, thinking well beyond academic proficiency.
It really was a statement that changed us. Like we stopped and we were like, wait, that's different. That hits different. And we haven't stopped talking about it, actually.
So powerful.
So the reason why this is funny is because I just got off ChatGPT, and I know we're going to talk about generative AI and the role it plays. And I'm always going through our data at the Urban Assembly, and so I was working through our data, and I looked at the graduation rates, and we looked at our school climate survey. And I just want to go through this with you a little bit on this notion of personal outcomes. So it says, okay, what are the predictors of high graduation and college ready rates from our school survey? And the first one was student teacher trust. High levels of trust between students and teachers are associated with higher graduation rate. This is Urban Assembly data, like fresh off of the press. Number two, social and emotional learning programs that support social emotional needs. Though the correlation is weaker compared to direct academic metrics. Course clarity and inclusive leadership, clear communication of course objectives and inclusive leadership. And then lastly, rigorous instruction. Schools emphasizing rigorous instruction, especially in core subjects tested, tend to have higher graduation rates. And this is not David Adams. This is AI, artificial intelligence, helped me go through my data to start to think about, hey, what should I be investing in to drive students who are able to contribute to their communities? And it turns out student teacher trust is the number one variable that drives these outcomes. And not just graduation rates, but in New York, we have a college ready percentage of that, right? College ready rates. So I was going to ask a question, and I was going to be this person saying, but what about the academics, Shannon and Candice? What about the children? What about the reading and writing? I'm still going to ask that question, although I think ChatGPT said that high quality teacher interactions, the kind of instruction that helps students feel relevant, does drive some of these academic outcomes in the Urban Assembly.
Yeah, well, I think that holds true. I mean, if we look at even John Hattie's work in his meta-analysis, right? Like the teacher makes the difference. And
Yes.
so that's long been the teacher effect and those relationships with kids. And kids have to trust that their teacher is invested in them. So I think your Urban Assembly data holds true to exactly what we have known from the bigger research. And I would say that, the neuroscience behind that is also important, because when we are co-regulated by our teachers as students, then our cortexes are open to be able to learn. And so it's not necessarily about the academics, but we do also have to have the rigor of the academics. We also know John Marzano, again, for a long time has been talking about low expectancy. When we don't believe as educators that our students can learn, they don't learn. We've known that for several years. So having teachers who believe in our students, the students that can trust in the teacher and make certain that they are regulated and be open for learning makes all the difference in the world.
All right, Shannon, Candice, I got to do this because I do this every time. Are you telling me that we are teaching students instead of subjects? Because I hear that I teach math, I teach calculus, and I'm hearing we teach students. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and I actually like to flip it and say the most important thing is not the teaching, it's the learning. So as long as we're learning in the classroom, it doesn't matter what you're teaching.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So you started a little bit, Shannon, talking about AI. I actually pulled in ChatGPT's AI capabilities to talk about how we analyze our data. And I do believe that you guys had an AI summit in Ohio recently. Did I get my information right there?
You did.
We've actually had 3 of them now, David. Yesterday was a third summit in Ohio.
My gosh.
So we have been honored to be part of a statewide project in partnership with AIEDU and the Ohio ESC Association. And Shannon and I here at the Montgomery County ESC kind of taken a lead in partnering with 3 other lead ESCs across the state to really try to build some capacities across the state and some foundational understandings around what is AI, how does this impact education, how does it impact our daily lives, creating opportunities, learning opportunities for everyone in the education space to really start to build on what should we be doing to prepare our students and how might we actually use some of these tools and some of these advancements to help us in our everyday careers and work.
That sounds like something I would be deeply invested in. And if the Urban Assembly could have been there, I'm sure we would have been there to talk about AI. But tell me, what are you learning? There's a recent report that came out from the Center for Reinventing Public Education that talked about how districts are investing in AI. About 18% of teachers have actually used AI, with a little bit more, about 40% looking to use it in the future. But there is a disparity between highly resourced districts and less resourced districts, either urban or rural, in their use of AI. Most teachers are focusing on things like differentiation. Where are you seeing the AI revolution, and how does that meet your vision of public education as a portrait of a graduate?
So I think one of the unique things about Ohio right now is that our lieutenant governor has actually been a leader in this area. And so he actually partnered with AIEDU before we rolled the summits out to put together a toolkit for educators. And we were actually asked to help do the press release for that. And the press conference was here in the Dayton region. So we were very humbled that we were leaders in that space, even at the lieutenant governor's level. So the fact that we have public officials and people that, the community looks to as the folks that take care of us, if you will, embracing this and leaning in, I think we're seeing a little bit more of an acceptance versus a hesitation, because we all know that anytime there's a breakthrough technology, and those are my words, but like the big breakthrough technology, right? Like the internet, it's the wheel probably at some point, fire at some point, right? So anytime we have these breakthrough technologies, there's always a little bit of like, how are we going to ethically make sure that people are using this in a way that doesn't dismantle humanity, but instead disrupts our normal means of life, but gives us a much better, effective way to do things. It really has been helpful that we've had state officials take the lead. And then as an ESC association, we've been able to follow behind and really think about, what should our policies look like? Because in my seat, right, a little different than Candice's seat, but in my seat, we got to make sure that the kids and the families and the students are taken care of. And that we don't, in the day and age of technology hacks and cybersecurity, we got to make sure that the boxes are checked, but it can't just be compliance. It needs to also make certain that all of the things that Candice talked about get done as well in a manner, and where there are conditions set around that allow it to be manageable and safe, and that our current employees and our students become AI literate. I think what we're finding is that the future workforce, there will be those who use AI and those who used to be in the workforce. It doesn't matter the sector. It's gonna need to be something that we embrace. But again, there's always that fine line of how people, the early adopters kind of jump right in. Some of us stand back and kind of wait and see how it works. And when we talk about AI in general, I think some people just even maybe underestimate how long we've been using AI already. But the machine learning and the generative AI, where AI is actually using other pieces of AI to do other jobs, that's where it's really going to get fun.
Hopping off of the fun idea, because I'm all about fun and education. For me, it's not stopping at just having folks use these AI tools, but it's really becoming creators of. And so when we think about that innovation component, and when we think about preparing kids with the skills to be competitive in the workforce that we don't even know what it's going to look like, for me, it's not just being able to use the AI, but being able to be creators of. Like, what can we create? What can we make? What can we develop? Let's think, magic wand, think beyond the typical.
No, I think it's great. I did have an opportunity to see some of the great pictures that came out when you guys had that press release with the lieutenant governor. And it sounds like leadership. One of the key aspects of leadership is to provide vision, right? Purpose, motivation, and vision. And so it sounds like when you have great leadership in place, then we can use tools like AI to get ahead of some of the challenges. And I do want to reiterate this because there are some challenges in terms of district adoption of these concepts and these tools. And there are disparities around who is doing what. So to see that you guys are ahead of the power curve, you're in that early adopter innovator space, I will only benefit young people because those are the folks who can get better at what they're trying to do in terms of learning what it means to be innovative in a new century. So I want to speak with that piece, and I want to think about Ohio and where Ohio sits in our 50 states. And I want to think about innovation in public education, because that is the name of our podcast here. So Shannon, Candice, what can Ohio teach the rest of the country about innovation in public education?
Yeah, well, actually, the Dayton region, like, we're the birthplace of innovation. No disparaging comments to our friends in the Carolinas, but like, we invented flight. We kind of put that stake in the ground and say, no, they're from here. But so was the cash register and the pop top. And I mean, at one point we had more patents per capita than Silicon Valley has now.
Wow.
And so, I think that we have to get back to our roots, and we have to really dig in and think about, and in some cases, we really never left our roots. We've always been that community to say, no, we're going to solve this and we're going to think differently about it. We've had our rough patches, but I think Ohio has already been a leading example of how innovation can work, from the airplane to where we are now. So I appreciate the heritage that we have. I think one of the most important adages that I always remind people, I used it when we opened our first AI summit with AI EDU a couple weeks ago, but the old adage of, if I see further today, it is because I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. And I believe that. I am so fortunate and privileged. I know that there were 11 men before me, and I'm the first female, but there were still very visionary men, and they were leaders. And so being able to stand on their shoulders and be able to take us to the, to that next generation, to that next space of where we can help young people is just really, we're very humbled and very blessed to get to do what we get to do every day.
I appreciate that so much. Candice, you have anything to add on that space?
I think maybe just bringing it down to like the school level when we think about Ohio and innovation. Shannon mentioned as a state and even at Dayton region, just a couple added components there is like the Cheez-It. Like we invented the Cheez-Its. We invented the scratch and sniff mark or stickers. So think about
that's the whole elementary school.
I know, like I have to bring it into education, right?
Yeah, I'm sold. I'm moving to Dayton. Let's go.
Those stickers are so important. But
yeah,
when I do think about just education in general, when we think about Ohio's emphasis on STEM and early college, high school. So really like building that through. We always say here in Ohio, we have great big P policy, like flexible credentialing systems. We've got competency-based learning policies. So we've got beautiful policy as well that can really help us become even more innovative. And then even as a state, the last few years, the state has really focused on personalized learning. So as a state, we have personalized learning specialists across the region, and they have been focused on really supporting schools. What does this look like? What are the models? Building a framework for us. So those are probably the main components when I think about education: the STEM, the early colleges, the credentialing, the flexible credentialing, and then the personalized learning approach.
Well, I appreciate that, Candice. And Shannon, I heard that not just STEM and not just credentialing or personalized learning. I heard you guys have some interest in social and emotional learning. Did I get that right?
We do. It's part of that humanity. Like if humanity is at stake, we had to decide like, well, what are we going to do about it? And I mentioned some of the, the turmoil that our region had gone through, and it was personal to us that we help our families. And so I restructured some of our resources here at the ESC and stood up a social emotional learning division. 5 years ago, we had 2 people. I was one of them. And today we have 80 people in that space, doing a whole lot of work around the whole child and whole teacher and whole person perspective. We've developed a curriculum with the singer-songwriter Jewel that is integrated into language arts so that we can really make certain that every child has access. To your point, sometimes we really deal with these equitable issues of districts who are resourced versus districts who are not resourced. And that was actually one of Jewel's main components. She actually wanted to democratize the mindfulness practices and the social emotional learning versus you had to go to this special school to get it, or you had to go to this special state to be allowed to have it. And so it was really important to her that we were able to offer the curriculum to whoever wanted it. But yeah, we do a lot of work with districts to really think about what are you already doing in school around those 5 competencies that Castle obviously has kind of staked claim to. But we've added a 6th one. We call it the future self competency. And it really is that ability to close your eyes and see yourself in the future. Because again, I come back to hope is at stake. And we have a lot of young people that their mental well-being, not just mental health, but their mental well-being, that's been an issue, and they haven't had the supports that they needed, and they can't do it. They can't answer the question, what do you want to be when you grow up? And we don't like that question. We really like to think about like, what quality of life do you want to have later in life? And then how can we help you get there? And in order to do that, we really have to make certain that young people have that future self vision, that they really can. I'll be the first one to admit, like I could close my eyes, I could feel myself in an F-16 fighter jet. I knew what it was going to smell like. I felt like being part of that bigger Air Force family. I was able to do those things. And those were visions in my head that allowed me to navigate life that I didn't even think about. It was just sort of innately being able to do, but it's because I had that vision. So that's the goal is to make certain that whether you call it social emotional learning or you call it whole child competencies or whatever word you need to call it, we just need to make sure that kids have those human skills and a way to see themselves in their own future.
I got a quick story for you, Shannon. So as you know, I'm in the Army Reserve. And when I was at what they called back then PLDC, Professional Leadership Development course, I was in Fort Indiantown Gap. And we were doing what we call land navigation. And it's like a 15-mile course. And you're walking around with your compass and your points. And this F-16 flew right over and like banked, like came like this. And it was at that moment, like that very specific moment, I realized I had joined the wrong branch. But now, obviously, I love the Army and I've gotten back and I still love the work that we do. But it was so cool. The F-16s are so fast and they flew over. And I was like, covered in mud and, my decisions that I had made in life. So I did not have a future self in the Air Force. I had a current self on a land navigation course at Fort Indian Town Gap, but I learned how to create future selves within that space as well.
Well, I had a full circle moment 2 years ago. So it wasn't the Air Force, but we have an air show here because we do have the Air Force Base and the International Airport. And it's a rather large air show. And so the Blue Angels came to town 2 years ago and I was nominated as the key influencer. So I spent 57 minutes in the air in an F-18 Super Hornet, and
Wow.
I did not throw up. I did not pass out, and it was really a full circle life moment. So it was fantastic, and Candice was there to witness it.
That is very, very cool. That would be like my dad's dream. He loves airplanes. I got to figure out then. You said a key influencer. That's what I.
Yep, and it's a community nomination, and I was actually ironically getting off of a commercial air flight when I got the email that said you've been nominated, and
it's pretty much the same thing though, right? F-18, 757.
Just a little different.
We talked about this idea of what Ohio has contributed to our country, what has contributed to our own communities within ourselves. Talked about how you got to be Shannon, Candice, in the seats that you're in. We talked about a public education vision that may be under attack in a way that it hasn't been in the past. We even talked about this idea of a portrait of a graduate, the role of AI, and ensuring that young people have the creativity to contribute to themselves in the community. And right now, I want to talk about innovation. And this is a podcast about innovation. And so I want you to think through about your careers and talk about what innovation do you feel like has been the most meaningful that you've helped implement in your career in Ohio or somewhere else? And I'll start with you, Shannon, and then move to Candice.
That's a hard question. And the reason it's hard is because we've been able to stand up what I would put against anyone who said, no, it's not. But I would say we've been able to put up some very innovative programming as well as product out there. And we've been fortunate to be able to do it a couple of times. So I can't say that it's my favorite, but I'll give you just a couple of examples where I think it's been needed.
Sure.
We obviously our SELA curriculum, I think it was innovative in the sense that we went on a hunt to find integrated curriculum. There was plenty of SEL curriculum out there, really quality stuff, but it took a place, it took time, it took resources, it took a specific person to teach it, to implement it into the day. And we decided we didn't want principals to have to ask the question, like, who's going to teach it? What period am I going to put it in? And how am I going to get kids in it? So I felt like our SELA curriculum was pretty innovative and it was an integrated approach. And then the second thing that I'll mention is that we also opened a preschool for foster care, kinship care, and newly adopted students and our youngest scholars, because my goal is to work myself out of a job. And I thought if I can give our youngest scholars at 3 and 4 years old, who have already encountered some pretty tough, traumatic experiences in their life, if we can give them social emotional competencies to tuck into their human tool belt at such a little age, because I can't stop life from happening. I can't stop tornadoes. I can't stop mass shootings. I can't stop recessions or opioid epidemics, which we have suffered here in the Dayton region. I can't stop those things, but I can equip humans with skills that will help them navigate life. So those would be two of the things that I think have been pretty innovative that we've been able to stand up.
Thank you, Shannon.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of follow Shannon. I think that really taking a lead in this building some AI literacy across the state, not just even thinking about it here locally within our county or even regionally, but really thinking about this statewide initiative. How do we really start to build some AI readiness and AI literacy across the state of Ohio and in education? So that project has been really cool. And then 2 years ago, under Shannon's leadership and her vision, we opened up a Future Self Center. And, we continue to hear superintendents and principals talking about the number of expulsions, the increased behaviors. What are we going to do with these kids? Like, how are we going to better support them? And Shannon and I both know and knew at the time, sending them home, expelling them, kicking them out of school is not the answer. It's not going to help them come back and be better successful. So we opened up a Future Self Center, took a risk, didn't know what it was going to look like, didn't know, what that was going to be in regards to impact for kids. But the first year we started with middle school, and for students that were being considered for expulsion, districts could consider, or their families could consider, having them register, enroll in our Future Self Center program. And that's a very restorative approach. It's a very non-punitive, like, we're going to make mistakes in life, but how are we going to overcome those? And how are we going to build skills so we don't continue to make the same mistakes over and over again, and support kids that maybe have some addiction issues, and maybe that's why they're getting kicked out of school. So through that program, we then year 2 extended it for grades 6 through 10. So we quickly went from 2 grade levels to let's just really like build this out and make it 5. Why not? And so there, I think for me too, is getting kids to feel connected, and the idea of a future self vision and having future hope, and a staff that has hope and believes in the students has been instrumental in that impact. And we get them out in the community. So it's important that they learn how to be out in the community and how to serve and how to give back and how to work together. So that has been a beautiful project and program, and really excited about, I think for me and for Shannon both, we think that that's what school should look like for all kids, not necessarily being this reactive approach, but how can we even start to build these models that can just be a part of the daily. This is what school looks like for our students.
Well, Shannon, Candice, it's been a pleasure to be with you today. Truly, you are the innovators in the context of public education, and the kids of Ohio and Dayton specifically are benefiting.
Thank you so much for having us. It's been great.
And David, we value the work that you're doing there. We can learn a lot from each other. Thank you.
And before we go, Shannon, Candice, has been a wonderful conversation here today. And I want to make sure that people know that this is public education, and innovation starts here. Thanks for listening to our latest episode of Innovations in Education, where we bring education leaders who have made things work in the education sector. If you like this episode, please subscribe so that you can hear more great content around innovations in education. I've been your host, David Adams. Have a great day.